Good morning, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. Thought I'd talk a little bit about the housing market from the building supply side of things. For those of you who don't know, I do work retail sales at a local lumber yard. I've been doing this since I was 18 years old, and I got famous here on YouTube for calling out the lumber market pretty accurately. Now, recently, I have been doing videos talking about how lumber prices are going to move up if we saw builder sentiment increase into the positive. That did not happen. We have builder sentiment going completely negative at this point, and the inventory of lumber levels is still fairly tight, but the prices are staying low. They are very stagnant at somewhere around the 500 per thousand mark, which is what we were experiencing prior to the pandemic. For all those who don't know, lumber prices have returned to normal and they are not moving, right? So a lot of people were looking at lumber prices and saying, look at all the inflation that has taken place when it ran up to 1,700 per thousand. But I was calling that as a misinterpretation of what was actually taking place. There was a huge inventory depletion prior to the pandemic that really was enhanced by the stimulus checks, and even more inventory depletion and curtailments taking place during the pandemic as people were told to stay home and not go to work. So now we are returned to somewhat normal conditions when it comes to the lumber market. What is not normal is the builder sentiment. That has gone completely negative, and a lot of it is due to the high interest rates. Now, really what the common narrative is out there is that these high interest rates have now put a burden on the buyer. The buyer is not coming to the table, and therefore the builder themselves don't want to provide a product that somebody is not going to be there to purchase. And so now the builder has pulled back in a lot of their efforts. At the same time, the buyers have really stepped away as well. This has created a very stagnant housing market. Now, something interesting that I found is that I was talking to a home inspector. So like the guy that you would hire to take a look at the home to see if it's in a condition in which that is going to be worthy of your purchase, right? So a home inspection done prior to, like, say, a purchase. And he said that he was so busy a couple of years ago, like off the charts, incredibly busy, to now he says there's almost no calls. He says it's almost done, gone. And he thought a lot of it had to do with his own, marketing, like he wasn't putting himself out there to get these type of calls. And I said, no, man, it's happening everywhere, right? There is a slowdown in the amount of purchases that are taking place out there. And if there's a slowdown in the amount of purchases that are happening, then most likely they are not going to need home inspections, especially if it's not going to be a brand new home. Right? I mean, a brand new home, you wouldn't necessarily need an inspection done, right? I mean, I guess somebody could just to make sure that the builder did it right. But ultimately, if it's a brand new home and it's been past, the permitting inspections and stuff like that, you're probably fairly confident that it's going to be an adequate home and that doesn't need any further inspections done to it. But if it's a previously owned home, then you would. But now you think about it, previously owned homes are not really selling, right? People are sitting tight with their low interest rates on their mortgages. Why would you give that up so that you could pay a higher interest rate on a different house? So now the idea of flipping homes has pretty much come to an end, right? I mean, there are still people who are doing it, but for the most part, it's not nearly as prevalent as it once was. So you can start to see the drain on the economy that begins to take place after that. If you have less home sales taking place, then you have less real estate agents, with a job. You have less home inspections being done. You have less remodels taking place because most people are remodeling their home when they first move into it, not necessarily, years down the road. I mean, there would be that idea that there would be remodels down the road, but for the most part, people who are purchasing a home or previously owned home are looking to update that home to their needs immediately, as opposed to, thinking about it that, hey, in 5 years, we're going to remodel this home. You kind of see where I'm getting at. So the amount of like construction that takes place with remodels begins to diminish. Home builders aren't in the game, so again, like, you know, the construction game as far as laborers or construction workers aren't necessarily going to be out there like they once were. And if you think about it, like home building or even just construction in general within the United States is like probably the #1 production item when it comes to manufacturing. I mean, most of the items that go into building a house are almost all exclusively from the United States if you are building within the United States. Yeah, a lot of the like fixtures and appliances and stuff like that may come from foreign production, but the construction of the house itself and all the materials that go into that construction are generally domestic supply. So when you see this start to diminish, well, that's a lot of production within the United States, not only just in the construction of the property itself, but then also the material, the production of the material that goes into producing a house also begins to diminish. And again, this is just like, feeding into less activity that's happening within the economy. So you can see that taking place when, these builders start to have a negative sentiment. So now when we look at what happened with the builder sentiment, they base it on 3 different conditions. Now, these conditions, current sale conditions fell 4 points to 46. Sales expectations in the next 6 months dropped 5 points to 44. And buyer traffic dropped 4 points to 26. Now, anything under 50 is negative. Anything over 50 is positive. So really, you think about it, the current sales conditions is at 46. This is according to the builder sentiment out there. So at 46, that's really not that negative. I mean, it is negative, so it's not good, but it's really not that far from the 50 that you would want to see, at least above 50 for positive conditions. So the sales conditions are not that bad, but it is bad enough that it is turned negative. And when you think about it in correlation to the buyer's traffic, which has dropped to 26, that is extremely negative. So although the buyer conditions, like the sales conditions, are not that bad, the buyer traffic is terrible. What does that say? Like the thought of buying a house right now is really not that prevalent through the buyers, right? But the condition in which to buy isn't that bad. So what does that really say? Like if the conditions to buy increase just a little bit, I would assume that the buyer traffic would really start to roll in, considering how negative it is right now. I mean, I just found that those two don't really seem to jive very well. Like, you would think that the buyer traffic being as low as it is would also have the sales conditions being very low, but they're not. They're just slightly negative. All right. Anyway, moving on. The sales expectations in the next 6 months have dropped 5 points to 44. So they had just barely been negative. They were at 49 and now it's at 44. So it's getting negative, right? It's going deeper into the negative territory. But again, it's really not that far from being positive. And again, this is the sales expectations in the next 6 months. So really, over the next 6 months, most likely, I would assume that most people don't feel that the interest rates are going to be going down, right? And so therefore, they feel negative about making a purchase at this time. Even though the sales conditions may be fairly decent considering how negative the buyer traffic is, everybody is sitting back. So what this information is telling me, at least from when I interpret it, is saying that everybody is sitting on the sidelines itching to jump in the game. All right? The buyer's traffic isn't there because they're not interested in paying at these high interest rates, but yet the sales conditions really isn't that bad, meaning that the possibilities of buying a house are fairly decent. I would assume that a lot of this has to do with the builders buying down the loans, right? Now, what this means is that when you go to buy a new house from one of these home builders, like I'm just going to use an example, D.R. Horton, just because they're the #1 home builder in the country, what they are offering is a home mortgage buy down. So even though you might see interest rates on a 30-year loan at somewhere around 8% or whatever it is right now in your area, these home builders are buying down a couple of percentage points, meaning that really a lot of these homes are being sold at like 6% mortgages, not 8%. And this is the sales conditions in which that like 70% of all sales are taking place. Now, you really think about this, it's not existing homes that are coming up for sale, it's new homes coming from the home builders that are really going up for sale. And those sales conditions have gone negative. Builders are not really excited about putting new inventory into the market right now. So what does that really say for the supply and demand issue? The demand is there, right? Buyer traffic isn't showing it, but really when you think about how many people you hear are saying that I wouldn't buy a house right now, I'm sitting and waiting. They're sitting on the sidelines. There is a ton of people, demand, right, that is waiting. They are itching to buy a house, but they don't like the prices that they are experiencing, and they certainly don't like the narratives that they are hearing about how high interest rates are going to bring the housing prices down. Right? So if you're sitting in that thought thinking, okay, well, I want to be a buyer of a home, I'm not really interested in paying on these high interest rates. The narrative out there is that the high interest rates are going to drive the housing prices down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit around and wait for that to happen. Meanwhile, the lack of inventory coming into the market because of the sales conditions and the lack of, buyers being prevalent within the market doesn't have the builders very excited about bringing new inventory to the market. So not only are people not selling because they want to be locked in on their low interest rates and they don't want to give that up, but then the home builders aren't really coming to the game either because the buyer traffic is so low. You see how this is creating a situation in which that the inventory levels don't really have the possibility of rising. Like you want to have a situation in which that the home builders are incentivized. They're like, yeah, we can sell this home. We want to build a house. We want to build 4 or 5 houses right now to take advantage of the situation. But even though that the buy downs are taking place and the sales condition are just slightly negative and not terribly negative, right? The buyers are not really interested in being there. And if the buyers aren't going to be interested, then neither are the builders. See, this is where I think a lot of people have gotten confused about like what it is that's going on within the housing market. A lot of people thought that once the interest rates rise, that it's going to cause an immediate downturn within the prices of the housing market. That didn't happen. Now, it did happen in a lot of areas, and including my area. I mean, house prices had gone extremely high even over the last couple of years. And yes, over the last year, 6 months, we have seen house prices come down. But they haven't even come down to the level that they were even 2 years ago. Just prior to the interest rates rising. You think about it, like how many houses have been sold since the interest rates have risen? Very few. Sales conditions have turned negative, right? Look at how many mortgages are being written right now. Very few. So very few mortgages have been taking place. Very few homes have been sold within a condition in which that is turned negative for the housing market. See, prior it was positive with the low interest rates. You can take advantage of low interest rates, right? I mean, that was a positive for housing. But once the interest rates risen, then that's a negative for the housing market. High prices, a negative for the housing market, at least for sales condition is what I'm getting at, all right? But now what are we experiencing here? A lack of inventory and a lack of sales. So, supply and demand. Demand is there. But the demand is for a cheaper house. Supply is not being produced, right? And we can see that coming from the home builders. So I'm just trying to say, like, what is it going to create? It's going to create a situation in which a lack of inventory and a higher demand is going to start creating pressure. Which way? For home builders to build cheaper homes? Well, how can that take place? Right? If the permitting, if the labor cost, if the input cost going into the home only creates a situation in which that the housing margin, the profit of margin, can only put the house at a certain price. Otherwise, the builder ain't going to be there, much like they aren't today, right? They're saying, hey, these conditions are not conducive enough for us to sell a home any cheaper than what we are doing it for. We can do our best to do a buy down, right? I mean, at least offer something up in order to incentivize the buyer, but they're not going to lower the prices any further because they can't. The profit margin just won't let them, right? So they just simply won't build. And now there was a time in this country in which that the average person, like the average dude who had just a regular average job with just a little bit of carpentry skills, could build their own home. That doesn't exist today. You really can't do that. Not like they once did. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible. But generally speaking, most people don't build their own home anymore. You know, even 20 years ago, that might have been the case. Like, you know, there could have been people out there, or at least some people out there, who would take advantage of the situation right now, saying, hey, there is cheap lumber prices. I'm going to construct my own home, save money on all the labor of framing this house up. Okay? But now the rest of the conditions in which that to finish that home have put it in such a way that it doesn't really put a condition in which that the average person could then complete that home. What I guess I'm getting at is that you have to be so continuous on it, getting the, you know, inspections done, getting all the wiring in, getting all the plumbing done, getting the insulation, getting the roof, getting the siding, getting all this other stuff, that doing it in steps is very difficult to accomplish within a timeline that is permitted. You know, you have to, like, once you start this project, you have to get it completed. But, you know, back in the day, you used to nail a few boards together and just kind of slowly construct a house. It doesn't work quite like that any longer. All right, I'm babbling on now. There's probably a bunch more stuff I wanted to add, but I'm just here in the morning just babbling away. All right, Uneducated Economist, you let me know.